welcome to the first day of Sustainability Business Live. I keep forgetting to put the ability on the end. My name's Mark Sibbald. I'm the editor of Fleet News Group, and I've been asked to moderate this panel, and I'm really excited to have with me Scott Maynard, who you might have seen doing the opening before. Scott, welcome. I have Lincoln DeCarl from SG Fleet down the far end, and have Lee Lee, I always get the pronunciation. Lee. Now, Lee's a former president of AFMA and also a very experienced fleet and facility manager. So a couple of suppliers and one voice of practicality and reason on the panel as well. So thank you all very much. It's really exciting to be in the first morning session when everyone's still excited and the theatre's packed. So hopefully we make it worth your while for coming along. So our topic is about closing the gap between ESG ambition and fleet strategy. Now, as someone who reports a lot on fleet, I often get asked when a fleet's going to buy electric vehicles. And I don't quite know the answer because there's a lot of targets that are being set, a lot of net zero targets. And I do a lot of work in the council space. And I think back in 2018, a lot of councils went out and said, by 2030, we're going to be net zero. But yeah, they're not quite there yet. And surprising, well, not surprising, many of them don't have a plan. And 2030 is not that far away. So there really is a big gap between what the sustainability teams are saying and what the fleet people are actually executing. So I was just going to start with an opening question, and I'll just get each of you to give a short response. So I suppose, Scott, starting with you. So from your perspective, what is the biggest gap between the ambition and the execution when it comes to fleet emissions reductions? What's the reason for the gap?
So I think there's a couple that really stand out as prominent. There's been the perception that an electric vehicle is so much more expensive than a petrol-powered vehicle to purchase, and initially that was true. But we've now got to a point with an expanded range where price parity is probably closer than it's ever been. The biggest challenge I think that a lot of fleets face now is which car do you go for? The number of options that are out there now has just exploded exponentially, and so many of them are the unknown, untrusted, untried. Which ones are going to survive? Which ones are going to deliver? And I think that makes it a really somewhat confusing landscape for fleet operators now.
So Lee, as a former fleet operator, you would have been one of the early ones testing and trialling electric vehicles. What do you think is the gap between the ambition and the execution with fleets?
Yeah, I think the gap is the actual execution. It's the actual doing. So it's knowing where to start can be pretty overwhelming. There's a lot to tackle. And you're not doing it alone. There's a lot of other people. We're all going through this journey together. So you really need to play into your networks and leverage off of others to see what they're doing. Because it can be a bit daunting not knowing where to start. But the important thing is to actually make a start. Be prepared to fail, do a pilot, but get something happening and learn off of others. And it's just getting the doing to actually happen.
Yeah, I think that doing. I remember hearing one of the Olympic athletes say, "Motivation is not a feeling; it's an action." And I think a fleet transition is the same thing. It's not a target; it's an action. So Lincoln, you represent SG Fleet, one of the largest FMOs in the country, lots of government clients who have also had targets. What are you seeing as far as ambition versus execution in electric vehicles?
I think from my point of view, it's actually the change management aspect. It's when you've got these policies that are being set at the executive level and there's a decarbonisation goal for the fleet managers, it becomes a fleet problem. In reality, it's a whole business problem. And that change management of actually, the things that you read about in the news and the anti-EV sentiment or the rage anxiety or the towing my boat on the weekends, they're going to play out within the organization. So it can't be just a selected vehicle. And by the way, everybody needs to run with that. You really need to get into the change management. So you need your DNC, you need facilities, you need IT, you need fleet. Everybody needs to get involved. You need to get the advocates as also the detractors, get them involved in the pilot programs, really shift their mindset to understand that it's not just, once they get into an EV, it's actually pretty easy, but it's that sort of managing the resistance and matching that up with the policy changes.
So I know a lot of older fleet managers that actually were ex-mechanics and they got into fleets and they didn't have to talk to people. But you're saying you have to actually engage and
Absolutely. It's key. I've worked for some organizations that are very sustainable branding. You would expect that everybody is drinking the Kool-Aid within the organization. When it came to the pilots, unfortunately, crickets asking for people to come along and try these EVs. And the arguments you get back, like I say, the same arguments that you hear in sort of the mainstream media about why people don't want to mint EVs, it will play out in your organization. You need to address it there all.
So Scott, one of the questions I always ask when I'm talking to organisations is, which E are you trying to achieve? You're trying to buy electric vehicles, or are you trying to reduce emissions? And if you're trying to buy electric vehicles, that's pretty straightforward. But reducing emissions is more than just tailpipe. It's about the whole cradle to grave, which you were talking about earlier. So how can fleet managers make better procurement decisions and demonstrate real emission reductions, not just from the tailpipe, but from just from the initial manufacturing process?
Yeah, and it's a really important thing. Up until now, we have been concentrating on what happens after the car is built and the fact that it's zero emission. But only from that point on, there's more and more information now available and being made available by all OEMs to give some confidence around the impact of the production of that car. Building cars is still a messy business. And it doesn't matter whether they're petrol or electric, it's still a messy business. But the amount of work that's being done now to reduce the emission contribution from the construction of batteries, which is probably the most difficult bit, and also the varying suppliers that go into making stuff like the electric motors, I think is now presenting fleet operators with far more information than they had before. And so it's a matter of obtaining that information and just asking a second layer of questions to ensure that information is robust now that those tools are there.
Are we now at the stage if everyone can buy an EV, so we can tick that box, zero emissions from the tailpipe, we now need to be asking that second layer a question of procurement to tell me what happens before the car gets in?
Absolutely. And there's so many really relevant questions. Is the battery serviceable, or is the battery a throwaway item? What does the servicing costs look like? Because with far fewer moving parts, the servicing costs should be significantly reduced. And are there studies to show what the recycling impact is? So much of the product that goes in is now accurately tagged for recycling and made to be recyclable. A simple example like door cards. On the door panel of a car, there's so many different materials and little components and bits. Can they be easily separated so that part can be recycled easily, quickly, and quickly? And it is that level of questions that I think forms a more rounded and accurate picture for fleet operators to be able to make the right choice.
And I'm just going to do a blatant plug here. Who's driven a Polestar in the room? Yeah, like if you get in it, it's a premium vehicle, but it's a sustainable luxury rather than a Gucci luxury, I guess. It definitely feels different. Lincoln, moving on to you and staying along the lines of the emissions reduction, like that's what we're trying to achieve. What sort of data should fleet managers be collecting so they can they get a baseline up front, and then what should they be looking at to report on emissions?
Yeah, I think you've got your multiple layers, and from a compliance level, you could get away with just the types of fuels and the literage you're putting in. So, your E90 is it diesel, and you multiply that by the emissions factor, and you get your carbon output. But to get really meaningful data, and by that I mean insights you can actually use to drive those behavioural changes that I spoke about, you need to get to the next level of detail. There's no point looking at your fleet and say, okay, on average we do 30,000 kilometers per vehicle. Each vehicle is going to be fit for purpose. It's going to have a different driving pattern. It's going to have different usage patterns. And something I've been thinking about recently is what does the term utilization actually mean? And my argument is it's going to be different for every organization. So you can have a car that is a pool car that's used regularly and it's racking up a lot of kilometers. Equally, you might have a utility that's full of tools, but it only drives 20 kilometers down the road, sits there all day because it's got access to the tools, it drives back. Now, you wouldn't say that use is underutilized. It's fit for purpose, it's doing its job. So when you're looking at the fleet profile, the utilization, you really need to look at it from is it doing its job? Is it effective? And to do that, you really need to understand your fleet. So telematics or connected car data really helps with that utilization, when the usage patterns throughout the day. And then if we use that information to define your orders and your transition plans as well, how are you going to adapt? And that won't be one rule or one process for every organization. And to be honest, it's not going to be the same rule for every vehicle in your fleet. You got to look at it at the micro level to really understand how you're going to transition across the lower emission vehicles.
I think that's a really interesting one because I actually got a phone call from a fleet manager the other day and I said, I finally got my telematics working. I can see my utilization. What benchmark should I be aiming for? And yeah, there's, as you said, there is, it depends on the asset and application, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, it does.
So once you've got the data, what sort of reporting and frameworks should you be using? Because you mentioned all the different stakeholders before. There's a lot of people you've got to influence. How should you use that data to get behavioural change, like reducing the fleet size or improving utilisation, or identifying the plug-in hybrid versus the BEV versus the different applications?
So I think you need to have a look at the data across the entire fleet and pick your low-hanging fruits. People often talk about trying to reduce your idle times. Now that when you're trying to get drivers to reduce their idle times, that's a really challenging behavior. They just want to idle. They don't want to turn it off. Maybe the air conditioning is going. So these sort of micro level behaviors the drivers are doing every single day, how do you shift those? It's an incredibly complex beast. Seeing utilization or idle times is the way, moving into the hybrids. I've been quite surprised at how well plug-in hybrids have taken off in the Australian market. I always saw it as sort of the worst of both worlds. You've got the heavy vehicles, but you've still got two engines in the car. It just didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But when you look at it through a change management sort of framework, you realize that actually plug-in hybrids is actually really quite handy because they've got the comfort level that they got to fill up with liquid fuels wherever they need, but then they've got where possible, use the electric engine. And we did we looked at the data. Sorry, I'll just keep going for a sec. We looked at the data and we just asked the question because there's a common discourse that plug-in hybrid drivers were always driving around on petrol or on liquid fuels. So we looked at the data. And what we actually found was the difference between innovative leases, which is your more retail and consumer based, for your corporate. Now, your corporate tool and train drivers were actually using liquid fuels a lot more than they were electric. Now, the reason for that, I think, is because the company's paying for it. In the novated lease that you're done going out the door, paying for the fuel, so more likely to actually be running on the electric. So it's horses for courses, and so again, go back to that usage patterns in the regions.
But just going off script a bit, how do you change that behaviour to get the plug-in hybrid? Like a lot of fleets I've spoken to, they went for plug-in hybrids because they went, "Oh, tick the box, done. It looks good on my asset register." But if you don't have the charging infrastructure in place, you're essentially driving a petrol or a diesel car, aren't you?
Yes, you are. I think and that comes down to the charging strategy, which is a really big topic of conversation with customers. And again, there is no one size fits all. Public charging works, and I saw a shift in the industry where the public charging network wasn't robust enough. So a lot of organizations were asking the question, well, I want to put in workplace charging. A couple of years ago, that started switching, and organizations were like, can we do away with not putting in the capital-intensive charging stations at work and just rely on the public network? Because, well, you can, but you have to pay extra. And now we're seeing a shift now more into the home charging and being able to have your tool and trade drivers charge over pay. Now that brings in a whole host of challenges around reimbursements, the tax treatment of it, and paying. And then if the electrons are coming for the solar versus from the grid, there's all these complexities. But then the point being is that the charging strategy is going to be different for each fleet. You need to think about where are they driving, where are they garaged, how often they need to be refueled. Shift again. Hard.
Yeah. So we've been talking fairly theoretical now. Lee, your experience is a bit more practical. Can you maybe step us through how the sort of things you've done or sort of work actually getting from we set a target, everyone signs off at an executive level. How do we execute it? Can you give us a bit of an insight of how that works?
Yeah, happy to. Setting a target, it's the best place to start. because, and it's probably the easier one. You mentioned some net zero targets, whatever your target is. Once you put that stake in the ground, then you've got something to aim for. And you step back and go, well, gee whiz, now that we've set that target, how are we going to do it? Because a lot of the time the target's being set and you don't know how you're going to get there. But it's a great thing to put it in the ground and say, right, well, that's what we've all agreed to do. It's then how do we actually put that into place? So having a plan, getting some people in to help, like I said before, you don't have to do this in isolation. But we've mentioned pilots. Pilots are really important. We're going through all those challenges with charging and behaviour change. Having people come in to help bust some of the myths around EVs. There's still a lot of myths in this space, and with EVs, what's real and what's not, and what are the challenges, and they do keep changing. But it's really looking at all of your current processes and challenging all of them and trying to embed ESG at every decision point. So that's where you're needing to get to. It's not easy, and with change management, it's a huge piece. So continual education. Sometimes you feel like you're a bit blue in the face, but everyone's going to be on their journey at a different point, and even other organisations. So there's others that are ahead of where you're at and or behind. So continuing those networks and conversations is really good, because you'll pick up bits and pieces and go, I'm trying to solve that problem and you solved it yesterday.
Some of the best examples I've seen is where people have actually looked at their operations and thought, we've always done it this way. In the new electric vehicle world, do we need to keep doing it this way? Is that what, when you talk about embedding into everything you do, is that what sort of stuff you mean?
Yeah, and I mean, from how you operate and also what you buy. I mean, you make a decision, we want to buy hybrids, we want to buy EVs. But it's all the behaviour change that goes with that. Some of those changes are easier, like transitioning from full petrol to hybrid. It's easier than transitioning to full EV because of the charging. And then we've got plug-in hybrids, which I think is really the point there Lincoln raised, is around that change management piece. I've still got that safety net. I'm not fully EV yet. I'm driving hybrid, have done for the last decade, and been in full EV for the last 6 months. So I've personally been sort of part of the pilot to help work out what does work and what doesn't before we then roll it out across the business, because you want this to succeed. But that's where pilots are really important, and you need to be prepared to fail, to go, we're going to try something and that hasn't worked, like, okay, let's pivot and do something else. But so to Lincoln's point, not one size fits all, and particularly the charging. So, whether it's home charging, office charging, or public, or all of the above, that all needs to be in the mix, and you need to make it flexible and easy for people to make it work.
Fantastic. And as a moderator, I'm going to go off script again because I have that luxury. But just to share a practical example, Blacktown City Council, they've been on social media recently promoting a truck of theirs they've called Cleopatra. And I don't know whether you guys have seen it, but it's a Volvo electric truck. And they built this truck, and they built a tilt tray on the back, and there's a beaver tail, and the engineering team of Blacktown are really proud of the engineering aspect of this electric truck. Well, what they've actually done for their mowing crews, so they used to have trucks and trailers driving around mowing all the parks of Blacktown City Council. Now, if anyone's driven a truck and a trailer and tried to get a mow onto a trailer on their truck and reverse, and if you had anything to do with heavy vehicles, you'd understand the risk involved in that, and the potential for damage and running into things. So what they did is they bought the electric truck, they put the tilt tray on the back. Now what they do is they drive their mowers from park to mark, and all the crew, and then the crews actually just go around and use and meet the mowers. And then they do this relay throughout the day of all the different parks from Irridlets and crews. So they've actually redesigned the operations of the Blacktown City Council mowing crews. Now, they entered an award that I was involved in, and the engineering team said, look at our fantastic engineering effort for this beaver tail tilt tray. And it was amazing. But I actually suggested, look, we're not going to win here, but maybe if you focused on the operational change, and which they did, and I think they won a local government award for that operational change. So, Lee, if I can paraphrase what you're saying, you've got to look at everything, not just the mission direction. And so, Lee, I have to thank you for humouring me with my little story there. But just to want to follow up on like governance structures and internal processes, like you mentioned, you touched on it a bit, but you know, the executive, if they've signed off on a target, you know, you need to put some stuff in place. They need to be asking questions, don't they, about, you know, what's happening, why haven't we done it all? Getting reporting, is that a critical part as well?
Yeah, the governance is really important. So I what we've found works, and I'd encourage you, is to leverage your existing governance structure. You've got your boards, you've got your executive, but I did look at how we were going to get this change across, and I just referenced WHS as an example. I looked at it and went, well, you've only got so many resources around budget allocations, and I just thought that was a really good model where there's usually a committee that they're embedded and they have reporting through to executive and the board. And I could see that with an ESG type committee, that a similar structure internally with governance. So you have got some resources and people and some key internal stakeholders around the table focusing on that topic. And it helps if, you know, if you're passionate. Sometimes there's just roles that need to be at the table, fleet, procurement, etc. if you don't have a dedicated sustainability role. And just keep at it, but report through. And it certainly helps if you've got buy-in at the top with the board and exec. And I think, you know, with net zero and whatever emission targets in, that's there. But always reporting back. I mean, talking about the behaviour change, you've got to set production targets at every category. So, you know, if people are either using petrol over plugging in, it's like, well, no. Each individual car has got to have its own production target, not just the whole fleet. So you just have to keep at it until you can actually start to see the results. And the other thing is sustainability. I mean, we know it's got the three elements. We talked about environmental sustainability, but if you focus on that, you're using less resources. So that's energy efficient. So that saves you money. So that's financial sustainability. And then, of course, there's the social sustainability as the other thread of it. But yeah, they're mutually beneficial. They're not mutually exclusive. If you focus on using less, you'll save money, and the payback is there for any investment you put into ESG.
That's a really good angle, saving money. Get all the accountants' attention and when they're in it.
Just, in there, Mark, is, something I was thinking of the other day, that people aren't necessarily resistant to sustainable outcomes. They're resistant to inconvenience. So really making sure that whatever policies you put in place, it is convenient for them, as they will push back. You could have the best sustainable story out there, and if you're making their life harder, you're going to have the front.
That's a really good reminder about that stakeholder engagement, trying to identify what's going to be in their budget. So, so just kind of moving on to the final question, and Scott, as sort of probably the most senior executive on the panel, how do fleet managers, get a seat at the table? Because, like Lee talked about governance and setting up a committee, which is really important. But quite often it can just be fobbed off when there's maybe more urgent things happening within a business. So what advice, probably just speaking as a senior leader, people, when people want to come and get your attention, how do we get the attention of executives?
I do think that it's getting easier, and being able to show the outcome and display it visually, which, as we spoke to earlier, is now being made easier by simply all of the tools that are being made available. And I still think that, practically speaking, trial these things. Trial a car for more than 24 hours. OEMs are lining up to make product available to corporate fleets that want to make this transition. And I do feel, and it's been picked up really well by both Lee and Lincoln, about the change management down to individual level. There's an enormous amount of resistance simply from a sense of not knowing. But as charge times improve, as range improves, as the grid improves, still some work to do, but as charging infrastructure improves, it takes living with one of these things for a week to really get it to start to click, and having that happen at the most senior level, so that it works back from there, I think is really effective.
Yeah, fantastic. Lincoln, you've dealt with a number of clients. You're trying to get them to get a seat at the table. What have you got? One or two bits of advice that someone could do over the next 12 months to get the attention?
Look, I think the pilots obviously very important. Look, we have a product in market we call eStart, and it's for a fleet company, it's a little bit different because in effect, it's a consulting approach. And our customers can choose from a menu of different sort of activities. And one of the ones we always recommend to start with is the executive level, stakeholder level education. So I would go in there for half a day with the executive team and actually talk through the basics of an EV, the charging, the differences that they have to consider with the fleet, because you really need to have that knowledge at that level that to then filter through for them to be able to make those policy changes. So education and awareness is the absolute starting point. Don't believe everything you read in the newspapers because it's not always true. And just need to get involved in it. Totally agree with Scott that it's once you get in, they call it the Tesla grin, back in the day. And just using the vehicles and just understanding that it's just a different fuel type, but the car is essentially the same. It still drives from A to B. You still push a button for it to start, and you turn the steering wheel, and it goes. Once you get past those initial sort of concerns around EVs being wildly different, I think let's screw it up.
Lee, you've given a lot of good advice, practical advice, as your experience in fleet management. So just to wrap us up, similar question about we're starting off talking about closing the gap between ambition and execution. So yeah, 1 or 2 tips for the audience to take away of how they can close the gap between what the stated targets are versus the actual achieving the targets.
Yeah, the tip is to do something. So the education's really important and that needs to be ongoing, but getting trials and pilots in, because there's nothing like feeling, touching, smelling, experiencing what it's like to drive an EV. We found that once people get into an EV regularly enough, whether it's be introducing it as a pooled vehicle, so when they book a vehicle out, it's allocating the EVs first, do the education session. Once they're in there, they actually just love the experience. But it's just getting people in it and busting the myths. And but once they do that, they're just actually loving the experience. The charging and the infrastructure, that's getting better all the time and still working through that. But you just need to look at each case. But actually doing something and demonstrating it to others, including the executive, really important. And then you start to get champions throughout the business, and they'll just start talking to one and say, well, you're driving an EV, tell me about it. And I've just started. How are you finding it? And it just continues to grow.
Thank you, everyone, for that input.